All right, welcome to part three of our early Cold War PowerPoint lectures. All right, so the Korean War lasted from June 25th, 1950 to July 27th, 1953. Now, after World War II, the 38th parallel, which divides this here, which is what divides the Korean Peninsula in two, North Korea became known as the People's Republic of Korea, and South Korea became known as named their government the Republic of Korea. South Korea, is better known as what most people refer to as Republic of Korea, is a democratic country, and North Korea is a communist country. All right. And the reason for that is because when they surrendered, the northern part surrendered to the Soviet Union, and the south surrendered to the U.S. So it shaped two different governments because of that. Now, the Republic of Korea, Syngman Rhee was the head of South Korea, and he is going to establish the capital in Seoul. And the U.S. government will only recognize the southern half of Korea, not the northern half. And if you look here, it's pretty close to Japan, China, Soviet Union. It's very close. All right. The U.S. pulled as much troops as they could out of South Korea. They figured, nothing's going to happen here. That's outside the defense zone. Well, the Soviets were convinced that the U.S. was not going to do anything to defend South Korea. So they decide, hey, they back North Korea. They convinced North Korea to invade the South and expand communism to the whole peninsula. And so on June 25th, 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, and that begins the Korean War. South Korea ends up calling on the United Nations to help stop the invasion. The Security Council of the United Nations approves the help. The Soviet Union was not there because they were protesting the presence of nationalist China. The Soviets were upset that Taiwan, or nationalist China, was in the UN and not communist China. Okay. And then if they had been there, they could have vetoed the action and prevented the overruling. So Douglas MacArthur is going to be chosen as the commander of the UN forces. 16 nations send troops. 520,000 troops will come to aid South Korea. 90% of these troops are from the United States. South Korea had 590,000 troops. MacArthur is put in command. And as you'll see here on the map, you'll notice that the North Koreans are pushing the South Koreans all the way to the perimeter of Pusan. And MacArthur visits the 8th Army commander, Walton Walker, and a witness said that MacArthur told Walker, "There will be no Dunkirk in this command. To retire to Pusan will be unacceptable." And what that means is that in Dunkirk was in 1940 when the Germans came in and took France. The French retreated off the beaches of Dunkirk, and that they weren't going to let that happen again. So at Incheon, the invasion of Incheon, September 15th, 1950, MacArthur plans a surprise invasion, amphibious invasion, landing behind the enemy lines of Incheon. He has come. The Americans are going to gain control of Incheon. You'll see here on this map here where the Marines landed. Red, green, and blue beaches were the name of the three beaches that U.S. Marines landed in. The UN troops will clash. They will recapture the capital, Seoul, and they will cut off the supply lines of North Korea, forcing them trapped, so they either have to surrender or they have to run for their lives. So many of them will run back to North Korea. Half of them will surrender. The Chinese will get involved as well. By November of 1950, the UN troops are pushing the North Koreans out, and conquering North Korea all the way up to the Yalu River. China had previously warned General MacArthur that they would not stand idly by and let the Americans come to the border. However, the UN troops continued to push North Korean troops back to the Chinese border, which is the Yalu River. By late November 1950, 300,000 Chinese troops will end up crossing the border to aid North Korea. And people often wonder, think about, this is kind of if China had not gotten involved, there might only be one Korean country, not two. By early January of 51, all the United Nations and South Korean troops are going to be pushed out of North Korea. The Chinese continue advancing south. They captured the South Korean capital of Seoul. For 2 years, they fight bitterly, trying to obtain positions in the Korean hillside. Neither is able to make important advances. And by April of 51, the United Nations would retake Seoul again and had moved back up to the 38th parallel. And now we're back to the same situation that we were before. Here's a quote from Beverly Scott. Beverly Scott was an African American soldier in the war. This is a quote from No Beagles, No Drums, an oral history of the Korean War. Our trenches were only about 20 meters in front of theirs. We were eyeball to eyeball. We couldn't move at all in the daytime without getting shot at. Machine gun fire would come in, grenades, small arms fire, all from within spitting distance. It was like World War I. We lived in a maze of bunkers and deep trenches. There were bodies strewn all over the place, hundreds of bodies. So this here is, you can see, go back to this map here. You'll notice that this line here, this is where most of the fighting, and they basically made trenches along this parallel, the 38th parallel, and just kept shooting at each other. So it was ugly. Well, MacArthur contacts Truman. He says, I want to send nuclear weapons onto the Chinese cities to get them to retaliate. Well, Truman rejects MacArthur's request. Truman was afraid that if knew that the Soviet Union had a mutual assistance pact with China, and that if they were to attack China, that would probably set off World War III. MacArthur was confident that his views were right. He went above Truman's head to newspaper and magazine publishers, as well as Republican leaders. On April 11, 1951, Truman made the shocking announcement that he had fired MacArthur. Americans were outraged over their hero's downfall. 69% of Americans backed General MacArthur. The city of New York gave him a parade. The Congress invited him to come speak to them. And that's a big deal because most people don't get invited to speak in front of Congress. Typically, you're only you have to be a foreign governor or a foreign leader from another country to be invited to speak to Congress. And in his closing remarks, MacArthur says, "Old soldiers never die; they just fade away." Truman was vindicated. The Congressional Committee, who agreed with Truman's dismissal of MacArthur, and eventually public opinion started to swing back in Truman's favor. But the war continued, and as we got closer to the 1952 election, it cost the Democrats the 1952 election, and for the first time in 20 years, the Republicans win the presidency. So on June 23rd, 1951, the Soviet Union suggested a ceasefire. So that we have the first truce talks will begin in July of 1951, and then finally by July of 53, an armistice was signed. The location of the ceasefire line at the existing battle line, which is the 38th parallel, and they created a demilitarized zone between the opposing sides. How did it affect the U.S.? Well, 54 Americans died, lost their lives fighting in the Korean War. The United States spent $67 billion on the war. It caused the Democrats to lose the 1952 election. It also increased the fear of communist aggression and prompted a hunt for Americans who might be blamed for communist gains. What about Korea today? Well, it's still split into North Korea and South Korea. South Korea has a great economy. North Korea struggles, severe shortages of food and energy. There's often talks about reuniting, but let's face it, it's probably not going to happen. Um, they have come together a few times when it comes to Olympics and whatnot, back like in 2018 at the Winter Olympics. Um, we think about some of the things that come out of South Korea. It's probably the second biggest tech center in Asia after Japan. You have major companies like Samsung are out of Seoul, South Korea. All right, so and then this is what we're left with, back to the way it was before. Here are some images of the Korean War. You can see here at the bottom these are some of the Korean hills where they fortified the area. And this bridge is here is part of the 38th parallel that divides the two. Alright, here's a picture of the Korean War Veterans Memorial in DC. And then here's a picture of it covered in snow. And this is important because there were parts of the war where it got very cold. North Korea is Korea is a mountainous place, so it's very tough to navigate. Here's another picture of the memorial, another picture from the memorial, another. All right, well, that is it for our lesson on the Korean War. Thank you for listening.